Welcome back to the home front. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I'm joined by Kris Goldsmith. He's an accomplished public policy advocate, nonprofit leader, and expert on the threats posed by domestic extremist organizations against American democracy. He is the founder and CEO of Force Butler Institute, a nonprofit organization that trains veterans in research and operations to counter extremism, teaching the skills and context necessary to keep veterans and their communities safe as they gather intelligence on dangerous individuals and hate groups. Today, he is coming to us from the Sunshine State of Florida. Kris, welcome.
How's it going? Thanks for having me.
All right, Kris, the reason why you and I think I connected with you about this time last year, actually, after I had seen you participate in a documentary. I guess it was a tabletop exercise, what they call a tabletop exercise, which is sort of like a, I don't want to diminish it by calling it a role-playing game, but the idea
No, that's
was,
that's what it was. Yeah.
yeah, but the idea was that there was, in the aftermath of a Democratic president being reelected, there was an insurrection type thing again, sort of a January 6th part two, in which militias were acting badly. There was a rogue general, I believe, and all of these, different things. And you were, I think, on the red team. You were one of the, playing on the bad guys side. And I recall at the end, and the reason why I reached out to you was because as they're going through all of the things that happened during the course of the simulation and all of the professional politicians who were playing the roles, it was clear to you anyway, and then clear to the viewer if they were watching you, that they didn't get it, right? That all of the things that had gone on for however many hours you guys had been doing that, and it was condensed into 90 minutes that I saw at Sundance last year,
Mhm.
that you were still like, nope, still don't get it. So give everybody an example, or not an example, I guess, but give everybody your perspective on why, even now, as we're so far downstream from what it seems to be, nearly 10 years of Trump, yes, but all of, look, I mean, white nationalism and the Ku Klux Klan, like these aren't new things to
Mhm.
the United States. But, violence, just, 4 years ago this week was, reintroduced in a big way to the United States. So tell us political violence, that is. So give us a sense of why you sort of shook your head and how you see the world now.
Yeah, so that was a documentary called, or I shouldn't call it a documentary, it was a movie
Yeah.
called War Game. And there's a reason that I did no press around it. It
Yeah.
was entirely hubris and hopium. The movie left people with the impression that don't worry, the good guys will save the day.
Hmm.
I was hired to build the red team, which is the bad guys, based on my real research, my real intelligence. And at every level, frankly, I was asked to pare it down and make it easier. Now,
Right.
as a former junior enlisted and sergeant in the United States Army, I understand that if a game is built for you to win, you don't learn any lessons. You come out being overconfident, and that was the primary flaw. And that is one of the things that you and I have had a lot of conversations about how
Hmm.
Democrats have just ignored all of the signs of rising authoritarian, rising threats of domestic terrorism because they just keep shaking their heads and saying, no, it can't be that bad.
Hmm.
But historians disagree, and that's who I'm listening to.
Right. And the reason why, I mean, you and I talk, I'd say not as often as we should, but regularly. And you have quite a story that I want to get to in just a minute. But the reason why I thought it was important to have you on this week was just 2 weekends ago now, we saw two incidents, one in New Orleans, Louisiana, where a former uh, member of the Army drove a pickup truck into Bourbon Street, killed 15 people, injured dozens more, and had been radicalized at some point, was carrying an ISIS flag, ultimately died in a shootout with local police. And then the more, if that was a terrible story, the bizarre story was in Las Vegas, Nevada, in the porte cochere of the Trump Hotel, where an active duty Green Beret, I think, had driven from, when maybe it was Fort Carson or wherever it was in Colorado Springs, in a Tesla Cybertruck, learned, as I understand it from news reports, Kris, from ChatGPT about how to build a bomb out of this thing. Committed suicide. The thing blows up, and then there's a whole flurry of his messages and everything about PTSD and this guy Sean Ryan, who I want to ask you about in a second, has some other dude on
Mhm.
talking about some email, and it quickly spins into conspiracy land. So first, I want to talk about the mental health issues of American veterans, and then secondly, just walk us through, because I know you've been through it, the process of being radicalized, or falling in with an extremist ideology.
Yeah, and this is a long story, but I'll try and keep it concise. I have a lot of things in common with that Vegas guy.
Yeah.
I have, PTSD. I suffered traumatic brain injury, though not related to my time in Iraq. I have felt like, the world, the system is not fair, right?
Hmm.
But we also had that in common with the guy in New Orleans, right? People have tried to kind of differentiate these two, the New Orleans terrorist and the Vegas terrorist. They're both terrorists.
Mm.
These are not, I feel like the media has really done a terrible job of minimizing, and this is in large part because of the Vegas cops being very selective about the parts of his rantings, his writings that they released. The guy was talking about going to DC, surrounding it with trucks and shutting it down and purging, doing a hard reset, right? Purging the government of Democrats. We're talking about actual fascism. This guy was a fascist. He may not have called himself that. He probably couldn't define fascism before he died, but he was a fascist. He wrote about how the 1%, had taken control of this country,
Sure.
and then a few sentences later says we all must follow RFK Jr., Elon Musk, and Trump. Like, the guy was a lunatic and
Yeah.
a terrorist. Yes, he had PTSD, but he didn't commit this attack because of PTSD. He
Mm.
committed this attack because he was vulnerable. PTSD may have been part of that. Bad relationships may have been a bigger part of that, but he surrounded himself in conspiracy theories. And because he believed in those conspiracy theories, he was motivated to use a choice that I think he had already made to end his own life, to make a spectacle, to make a call to action. And that was a call to action to other MAGA extremists to commit politically motivated violence. He was calling for MAGA to commit terrorism. And the press has really minimized that. And that's extremely unfortunate because it's profoundly dangerous.
Well, and throughout, let's call it our time, Kris. You and I think, are of approximate ages. You're probably a little bit younger than I am, but this has been something consistently downplayed in our time, because again, whether or not it's the order back in the 1980s,
Mhm.
Timothy McVeigh in the wake of Waco, and obviously the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. The Turner Diaries, which is this horribly written handbook on, basically how to overthrow the government. This stuff is not new, but to your
Mhm.
point, it seems like when these things happen, it's this collective scratching of the head, and can you believe it again? Whereas, no, there has always been a threat of these things. And to your point, now it's, we think of, 90 years ago in brown shirts and, this very organized group of people standing on corners and singing songs and beating up Jews. But this is a much more, they might be alone, right, in and of themselves, but like there are a lot of wolves out there, and we shouldn't be under any illusion that in the coming days and weeks and years that there won't be more of them, because again, there's a call to arms. I just think about now 4.5 years ago, Kris, when in the aftermath of George Floyd, Donald Trump said, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. And that was a call to basically, from my perspective, federal, state, and local law enforcement said, take the gloves off, do what you're going to
Yeah.
do. And we saw that. And so, do you think that's a little bit of what we're seeing here, which is this guy is trying to rally, others of his ilk and his belief system that, even with Trump returning to power, that, the Democrats or whoever the evil ones might be still need to be purged?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have seen the incoming, I don't know if he's going to get confirmed or not, potentially Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. Seen him talk about on his podcasts and on Fox News about justifying violence against protesters, use
Yeah.
of military force against Americans. This is the rise of fascism. It's happening to us in real time, and people aren't taking it seriously enough. This MAGA extremist absolutely heard Donald Trump's call to action. And Donald Trump has repeatedly promised to pardon the January 6th insurrectionists, including those who committed violence against police officers.
Right.
And when he does that, that is going to create a renaissance in the militia movement, the unlawful militia movement. I expect by this summer, and part of my entire job, what makes me good at what I do is I predict violence, right? I am uh, pretty good, and it is terrible to be good at it. But I
Right.
think that this summer we will see Donald Trump very likely start to create um, state authorization behind militias that are patrolling the border, that are working to as vigilantes to supposedly combat, child trafficking, but they're really just going after immigrants. I think these things are going to get kinetic by this summer. I don't think it's going to take late into his term for militias to start getting permission to start acting as if they're part of the state.
Well, it's interesting you say that. In one of the another simulation I did with the Brennan Center for Justice last summer, I was there was the simulation was like that. It was that a Trump type character had retaken power, and they were going through this particular one was about the border, as you laid out.
Mhm.
And the guy sitting next to me, everybody was very smart. Don't get me wrong; these people were hugely intelligent, hugely experienced. I was fascinated that some of the former Democratic government officials really took to their job as bad guys very, very well. Like they had really done their homework, Kris, which is in a weird way I appreciate it. But the guy sitting next to me goes, "I don't know why we're doing this with the military." He's like, "The U.S. Marshal Service can deputize anybody they want. They do it all the time." They deputize, state and local law enforcement for, if they're picking up a guy on a warrant or whatever the case might be. And I think that's the other part too, is that we have, become inured to the idea that a lot of, people, the chattering class is talking about, oh, Congress and this and that, what bills can get done. I mean, they can do all this stuff with just, expansive executive authority and frankly, a judiciary who's like, go for it. Right.
Yeah.
And so that's the part that I think you're right about. And then, there's another part of me too that believes, and I hate to believe this, that if let's say that we have unrest because of attempted mass deportations or economic distress because Trump really does put 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico and 10% tariffs on everything else, and prices go through the roof and
Mhm.
inflation spikes and unemployment goes up, that they could then use those same forces to keep, the average citizen, not someone trying to come across the border, at bay with the Insurrection Act and all those other things they've already promised to do, and their Project 2025 suggests he should do as soon as he takes office.
Yeah.
And so that's the one that, and I know that you feel the same way I do, which is, playing Cassandra can be exhausting, especially when you're standing on the hilltop going, look what's going to happen. And people are like, it's not really going to be that bad. And then you go back through history again and go, well, maybe if you didn't make so much noise, you'd be okay. Maybe if
Yeah.
these people had just done what they were told, they wouldn't have ended up like this. And of course, as there's an old trope, right? You can ignore politics, but it rarely ignores you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've been unfortunately playing the role of Cassandra for
Right.
years now.
Right.
Leading up to January 6th, I was infiltrating extremist organizations because I saw them organizing around the Stop the Steal lie, right? You know, Zuckerberg just came out this week and talked about how he's going to get rid of fact checkers and he's going to let users, he's unemployed labor, right? Or, you know, unpaid labor.
Right.
He's going to have users police the platforms. Well, it was people like me who were going into Facebook groups, you know, moms for Trump, and watching 3% security force and the Oath Keepers actively recruiting people, bringing them onto other platforms. And I have seen, since I followed these people onto other platforms, you know, 2 degrees between Facebook and people carrying firearms and practicing together in the woods to raid the Capitol building, right? And that was November, December of 2020. That was before the insurrection. I was handing all my stuff to the FBI, right? Video recordings, audio recordings, names, addresses of all these people. And, you know, as far as I know, none of the intelligence that I handed over was ever used because, you know, frankly, law enforcement has been nervous about prosecuting MAGA terrorists until after they've already committed an act of mass violence. And by then it's too late.
And let me just ask you this, and maybe this is an unfair question, but why is it, do you think, that the gentleman, I don't want to call him a gentleman, the man in New Orleans who was
Mhm.
professing ISIS, right? Gets all the attention, and obviously MAGA and Trump attempt to tell the story that he'd come over the border in Eagle Pass. But the truth was he was born in Texas, in Beaumont, East Texas, lived in Houston, had served in the military. Um, so that's one that's easier to capture the public attention because, you know, for decades now, right? Whether or not it's because of the first Gulf War or the second Gulf War or 9/11, right?
Mhm.
Uh, you know, Islamic terrorism has been, something that the American populace broadly has been very concerned about. But we turn to the active duty Green Beret, and it's a whole different story. Why is it that terrorism isn't just terrorism?
Well, the Fox News audience has been trained like Pavlov's dogs to respond in a certain way to threats of Islamic terror, or more recently, over the last 10 years, especially of, you know, terror coming across the border.
Mhm.
But they do not apply the logic that they use to build fear and a response to these you know, acts of terror or these imagined things that are terrorizing them. You know, if they wanted to be concerned about murders resulting from things crossing borders, they'd be concerned with states that don't require background checks because that's where all the guns come from to go to Chicago or to go to New York
Right.
or anywhere else to commit acts of mass violence all the time. Or you know, criminal violence, uh, rapes and murders and all these types of things that they're constantly talking about on Fox News. The tools for that come out of states with no laws.
Hmm.
So, you know, the reason that that the Fox News audience, you know, more than half the country is influenced in thinking, oh, Louisiana, that was terrorism, but Vegas was not, was simply because of the name and the color of the skin.
Right.
And it's as simple as that. Donald Trump, facts don't matter. It,
Right.
it doesn't matter that this man was born in Texas before he committed a terrorist attack in Louisiana. It doesn't matter where the Vegas terrorist was born. All that matters is the color of their skin. And Donald Trump doesn't care. He's still going to say it's a cross-border problem.
Let me turn to your personal background because I know that, as you noted, you were in the Army. You're a non-commissioned officer, and you have a story that I want you to tell in just a second. But I'm going to ask this question first: was whether or not it was the man in New Orleans, the man in Las Vegas? Remember the Fort Hood shooter, the
Mhm.
man in Maine who I think killed 15 people with an AR-15 several months ago. Um, what is happening within units? And now the gentleman in Texas is a little bit different because he'd already retired. But give me a sense of what's going on within these small units, whether or not it's a squad, a platoon, a company. are the guys, and there's still predominantly guys, I assume, in frontline
Mhm.
combat units. Um, are they looking out for each other, or is it one of those things where it's, in a mental health capacity, it's don't ask, don't tell? What's going on so these kinds of things can bubble up inside someone and then suddenly explode into mass violence and ultimately mass death?
Oh man, I could talk for days about this because this is incredibly complicated. There are in the small elite units that people who've been in the military for 20 years in an elite unit, between training and deployments, they've been exposed to countless explosions. Recent research has shown that it doesn't take, C4 on a doorway with, Rangers and special forces blowing things down all the time during their training, right? It doesn't take that level of impact. Simply firing a weapon thousands of times per year, those are all concussions that are happening close to your head.
Right.
So there is a massive problem of brain injury that cannot be measured until the person is deceased and they
Mm.
can perform an autopsy and look through their brains, right? With that said, veterans are not more, service members and veterans are not more likely to adopt conspiracy theories than the average American,
Mm.
but that's only slightly. About a third of Americans believe the great replacement theory. They believe that white people are being replaced deliberately
Right.
by a secret evil cabal, which usually turns into an anti-Jewish conspiracy theories. Names like George Soros get thrown around. This is like what Elon Musk is really promoting the hell out of right now. uh, Troops and vets are less likely to believe the conspiracy theories that motivate people towards mass violence and terrorism. But being having military service once someone is committed to doing a terrorist act makes them more likely to be effective, if you can use that
Sure, of
word,
course.
in committing a multi-victim attack. So that's the part that makes this dangerous. The reason why extremist groups target troops and veterans, whether it's ISIS or it's neo-Nazis here in the United States, is because we are effective members of teams. In fact, it's the same traits that Bank of America and JP Morgan deliberately go out of their ways to target veterans for recruitment because we
Mm.
are evangelists for our brands. We are team players. When our mind is changed on something, whether that's our voting behavior, our ethics, our personal values, we are more likely to bring those in our immediate social circle with us along that journey. And that can mean, going from Republican to Democrat, or that can mean from Republican to MAGA terrorist,
Right.
or joining ISIS, that like we saw from the case of Louisiana.
And is that because when you're in the field, when you're in combat, you got to be all in, right? Like if you're going to save yourself, then you've got to save the guy to your right and the guy to your left. And if
Mhm.
anybody's sort of slacking off, then it could be all of your rear ends in the sling. So is it just one of those things, which is, yes, I mean, there are plenty of examples. There's a TikTok guy who sort of goes through the mundane nature of the army when not in combat, but in combat, right? Like you
Mhm.
got to be all in.
No, it's basic training. So I think
Yeah.
I think this is a Hollywood misconception.
Okay.
Most people think of basic training as training you for combat and
Right.
taking people who are out of shape and turning them into the best shape of their lives. Yeah, okay, some of that happens. No one is ready for combat straight out of basic training. Full stop. It's
Right.
nowhere near enough training to make you ready. What basic training does is it weeds out people who want to be the hero, people who are
Mm.
not team players. It teaches you how to rely on other people, and it teaches you that you can trust these people. That trust building, that reciprocal teamwork, right? It's not just one person giving to another. It's
Right.
not just top down leadership. It's everything is collaborative. That About that piece of basic training is something that veterans take into the rest of their lives. It's what makes us more likely to start a business, more likely to run for office. When you start a business, you're not doing it alone, right? You're
Right.
you're almost always, unless you're on Etsy, you're
Right.
always doing it with a team, right? It's that teamwork that is beaten into you in basic training. That is the thing that makes us excellent bankers for JP Morgan Chase, and it makes us effective terrorists.
Well, and so let's go through your personal story. So you were in
Mhm.
the military, you came back, you live in New York, and you're going to school, as I recall, right?
Yeah,
And yeah, go
let
ahead.
me
Yeah, you tell the story. I'm not going to tell it for you. You tell the story, please.
Yeah, so I grew up in New York. The towers fell when I was 16. I had to wait a couple years to join the army, graduate high school. So I get join the army in 2003. By 2004, I'm in basic training. A year after I go to basic training, I am setting foot in Iraq. So January 2005 is when I kind of have um, my political shift, where I had been a Bush Republican as a kid, until I set foot in Iraq, and I was like, they gave us the order of don't look for weapons of mass destruction, and I was like, well, what the fuck am I here for?
Hmm.
Uh, I'm here for a year now, and throughout that year, I experienced horrific stuff. Like, yes, people tried to blow us up. Yes, like bullets would whiz by your head randomly, which is not combat by most people's definitions, but you could die at any moment. That messes you up pretty bad. At the
I would
age of
say
19,
that's not normal. So if
yeah, yeah.
someone's shooting at you actively on a daily basis, yeah, that's not something that I would be okay with. Yeah, like I
So
would not
most
handle that.
Yeah, and most people think about PTSD as like a single traumatic event. And I think that medicine is finally starting to move away from this
Hmm.
after years of focusing on like, well, when did you watch someone die or you saw someone get blown up? And they're starting to realize that a period of stress of a year long where you think you could die at any time and people are trying to blow you up, people are shooting at you every day, that changes your
Sure.
biochemistry. It changes the physical makeup of your brain, makes your body forever tuned more towards high stress responses. And for some people, that can be healthy. When I am on my meds, I'm a CEO of two organizations, plus I run my own business, and I'm
Right.
I'm working for another nonprofit right now. Right? We can be high performers because of that, or it can go horribly for us. And it did for me. After I came home from Iraq, I was disillusioned. I didn't feel like anything that I had done in my time in Iraq was effective, not for the United States and not for the Iraqis. And I came home with a lot of regret. I regretted the harm that I had seen done to the Iraqi people, though at that point in my life, I was still very, frankly, racist and Islamophobic. I hated those people. It was very complicated for me. I felt for them, but didn't quite get it yet. It
Sure.
dehumanized them as part of not just my training, but my upbringing as a Fox News watcher. And that led to, in 2007, PTSD had gone untreated for years at that point. It wasn't really part of the American lexicon. We weren't talking about vets and PTSD at that point. I couldn't get help when I tried. So I attempted suicide. I attempted to take my own life. And like the Vegas bomber, I suspect that he had already made his decision to attempt suicide. And I think, like me, he decided to try and make that death mean something.
Mm.
In my case, I was stop lost. So stop loss no longer exists, but back then, if your unit was deploying, the Army could just extend your contract. So my contract was set to expire in May of 2007, and that same week turned into my new deployment date.
Mm.
So I got orders to deploy. I had like 3 weeks, 3 months to adjust to the idea of, instead of going to college, I'm going back to war. So I attempted to assert control over my being, and that would be to end my life. And in doing so, I wrote on my arms, "Stop loss killed this soldier."
Mm,
right? I attempted to give my life and my death meaning. Thankfully, I survived. I was kicked out of the army for it in a bad kind of way. They treated it as misconduct. And that sent me down, a path towards radicalization. After I left the army, I was pissed. I had a real reason. I lost my GI Bill. I'd been stripped of my honorable discharge.
mm,
I had been sent to a war that was based on lies about weapons of mass destruction, right? I had real reasons, real tangible life impacting reasons to be mad at the government. And thankfully I entered instead of joining like the MAGA cult, I joined the anti-war movement. And there
mm,
were some really radical parts of that.
sure.
But good for me, it was across a broad political spectrum. So whereas I first started off with like the hard right libertarian types, the guys who ended up quite literally starting the Oath Keepers around that time,
Mm,
after Obama won. And there was the far left, the socialists, the anarchists, the communists. And because I was in a physical space where I could kind of see the spectrum in that way, I recognized that, oh, I'm pretty far out there.
mm.
And through forming a relationship with an Iraqi refugee who was on the far left, we had a very unhealthy but helpful relationship, I think, for both of us. We both, I think, met each other in the middle. And I was able to put my life back together because I got rid of the conspiracy theory thinking. Once the government had truly like fucked up my life, they had kicked me out of the military without my GI Bill because I attempted suicide. They treated me like a criminal when I should have been treated as a patient in
Right.
need of healthcare. Um, that could have been my radicalizing moment, right? It could have sent me down an incredibly dark path. But thankfully, I still had access to the VA. I still had access to VA healthcare. And it took like 5 years for me to get out of a dark period that I don't remember most of my early 20s. Um, it has given me the opportunity to get an education, to move forward with life, find another purpose, find a new team, find my new tribe, and start being an effective defender of democracy again.
Well, let me ask you. I mean, the thing that I've noted and noticed over the years, Kris, is that it seems like that these movements gobble people up in pretty big
Mm.
numbers, but they sell one at a time. That for every one of you, right, there could be. I mean, you tell me if there's a study or whatever, but there could be 8 or 9 guys who don't get out. Now that's to say that there's an overwhelming mass of veterans who are waiting to be radicalized. My point is that you found your way back toward the light, but as we saw in New Orleans or we saw in Louisiana, there are plenty of, or excuse me, in Las Vegas, there are
Mhm.
plenty of people who might not. So what was the process for you doing that? I mean, I think one of the conversations we had was that there were some guys at the school where you were studying that noted, wait a second, this guy looks like he might need some help, and they came and sort of brought you in. So walk us through a little bit of how that works, because maybe without that, right, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation today.
Yeah. So I got out in 2007,
Hmm.
and I spent the next few years really self-isolating. The only way I had very severe post-traumatic stress disorder, and I hadn't really learned enough about it to recognize the symptoms and therefore work to mitigate them.
Right.
Medicine alone does not work. You need to essentially, therapy is like training. You need to
Hmm.
recognize problems so that you can work on solutions. It took me years to work towards that. So if I wanted to go to a bar to be around people at all, I had to drink, right?
Hmm.
I didn't recognize it. Now I see it as self-medicating. I didn't have that as part of my lexicon back then, right? I just recognize that if I'm sober and I go to a bar that's, I'm bumping arms with people, I'm going to get in a physical altercation pretty
Right.
quickly, right? That is who I was back then. Um, and I spent my first couple of years until 2013. Any job that I had, I was working alone. I worked in a shop building photo booths. I'm good with my hands. I, I'm creative, but I was working alone. I was not around anyone. When Hurricane Sandy happened, it was a blessing and a curse. I had 5 feet of salt water come through the shop that I worked in, destroyed all of the tools, destroyed everything that I had built and everything that my boss, had invested in over years, and he couldn't keep me on. And at that point, I found out that I was eligible to use this thing called vocational rehabilitation for disabled veterans. So it pays for school, not in the same way that the GI Bill does, doesn't support you by paying for your housing and food and that kind of thing.
Sure.
But paying for school is a good start. So I started at a community college, and to be honest, I had lost all my confidence. My dream of joining the army and serving my country had turned into a nightmare. I felt like a failure. I was treated like a failure when I was kicked out of the army. So going to community college was scary to me. I wasn't the greatest high school student. So when I finally got the confidence to walk in and sign up for classes, Nassau Community College in Long Island had a veterans center, that a physical space where I could go into, and I was very fulfilling a lot of negative stereotypes about veterans. I was wearing headphones. I was, had my hoodie over my head. I'd sit down in a corner and do my homework by myself. And a bunch of other guys who had been in similar spaces, a bunch of other like infantry and forward observers, saw the signs right away, and they had already been further along in their transition and physically picked me up off the couch and was like, "Hey, dude, let's hang out. Let's go get some lunch. Let's do this." And I went over the course of one semester, not sure that I could make it through a class, to a 4.0 and being elected as the president of my student veterans organization. So in the course of like 3 months, this new community of veterans that I found pulled me out of 5 years,
Right.
6 years of a horrific depression where I was not moving forward in life, and set me on a path towards, you know, not sure I could make it through one community college class, to graduating from Columbia University, to launching my own businesses, to starting several nonprofits. I am literally living far beyond my wildest dreams. I've already achieved more than I ever set out to. And it's because of those veterans recognizing me in a vulnerable position and just giving me the community that I needed to start the real journey towards healing.
Right.
Because therapy and drugs was not enough. Without community, you can't do it.
No, and I think we're seeing that on a daily basis. And I cannot tell you, Kris, not only with you, but almost on a daily basis now, I'm having conversations with people in very similar circumstances, and also in a very similar thing, which is it keeps coming back to community, keeps coming back to people being together. You and I
Mhm.
happen to be speaking over Zoom, right? I hope to meet you in person one day. Right. But I think that whether or not it's COVID or technology or whatever, like we have gotten so used to being isolated that we forget that third part, right? Which is, yes, you can go into the therapist's office. Yes, you can pick up that prescription, but that's maybe leaving 50% on the table, which is like we're social animals, right? You
Yeah.
still need other people to say hello, to validate, to say, "Hey man, like how you doing?" Right? I mean, it's the reason why, the churches have fellowship groups, or you guys have veterans of foreign wars, right? Like there are reasons
Hmm.
why, because it could be, a similar outlook, it could be similar experience, but without that human contact, without the friction that comes between people that creates those real tangible bonds, we're all just sort of flying around through the universe, trying to figure out where the hell we're going. So now, tell us a little bit about Task Force Butler and what you are doing and what you're hoping to achieve, as we now, we're just a week or so away, Kris, from what could be, I'm afraid, a very dark time in our country.
Yeah. No, it will be a very dark time in our country. With that said, I'm here because I'm not giving up.
Right.
I am a fighter. It gives me purpose, and I have found my community through fighting. Um, so After I made this recovery, after I started going to Columbia University, I started telling my new friends about what had happened, and these guys were like, "Yeah, we know a bunch of guys that this happened to. Like they clearly had PTSD and they were kicked out for misconduct." So I started working as a veteran advocate, um, first for myself to try and get laws passed to help me get my honorable discharge that I knew I deserved.
Hmm.
Um, and through that, I found a mentor at my community college who coached me through how to get a law passed. It was very serendipitous. This guy's name is Chuck Cotolo. He had been the senior legislative counsel for then Senator Carl Levin, who
Hmm.
at that time was the chairman of the Armed Services Committee.
Right.
So from my first trip to Washington that he set me up on in January to December, I got my first law introduced and passed in under a calendar year. So I turned out to be really good at that. I started my first nonprofit teaching people how to do that. I was hired by a real veterans organization, Vietnam Veterans of America. And through that organization, I became a real policy expert, walking around Capitol Hill, working on everything from healthcare to DoD personnel policy and you name it. And while I was working at that organization, I became their chief investigator because I found that the Russians had created a fake version of my employer online, Facebook,
Mm.
Instagram, Twitter, you name it, several websites. So I first wrote the book literally on the 10 different ways that troops, veterans, and our families are targeted online by foreign adversaries. Then the pandemic happened. I got laid off along with most of the staff, and a buddy of mine called me out of the blue, someone I served with, biggest badass I've ever met, former Army sniper. We had never had a conversation about this before. He goes, "Hey, Goldie, I joined a neo-Nazi organization and I want you to help me take them down." So
Hmm.
when he used that term neo-Nazi, I thought he was exaggerating. I thought he was talking about like a crazy militia or something.
Right.
It wasn't until I was infiltrating this organization with him, and that I was in their communication platform. It's called Rocket Chat. It's like Slack, but open sourced,
Mm.
where I realized these guys are self-radicalizing, reading Mein Kampf. They're reading the Turner Diaries, and these are young guys, like these Gen Z. Not
Yeah.
all vets, mostly civilians, but these guys were looking for that type of community, and they were finding it in this extremist organization. And they were talking about things like deliberately getting COVID and then traveling to areas filled with people of color to deliberately spread it, right? We're talking about biological terrorism. Like that
Right.
meets the federal definition. So after that happened, after I was exposed to that, I couldn't get away from it. Like this is what I've dedicated my life to. I launched a nonprofit called Task Force Butler Institute, where I train other veterans to conduct open source intelligence research on these extremist organizations. Our goal is to gather evidence of criminality and to provide it both to law enforcement and to victims so that they can be held accountable in a court of law, both on the criminal side and on the civil side. And we've been wildly successful. We've produced a few major reports that has led to at least 5 federal lawsuits that I know of. All of them have been won by the plaintiffs. We've got our first felony conviction just last year, and that is in addition to dozens of arrests that our research has helped to facilitate.
Well, I mean, that's incredible. And I mean, Kris, I think that in this time, you represent not only because of your service in the Army, but also the service outside, after your career in the military. You represent the best of us. And,
Thank you.
I would hope that the folks listening, we'll put all the information about Task Force Butler Institute in the show notes. But, I think that you are the kind of leader that the country needs because you didn't give up, right? And we have a lot of work ahead of us, right? And a lot of it is going to be unsexy. A lot of it is going to be, again, just getting people together, just
Mhm.
making sure that we find those people who do have common cause, common purpose, and to your point too, finding those people who are on the edge and saying, "Come back here." You're not
Yeah.
alone because to your point, and I think this is a really important point that I think is being completely missed, and you've lived through it, especially with a lot of young men, is there's this, total, like they're looking into their future, Kris, and they're seeing a void, right? And they're seeing a world. And we tend to concentrate on young white guys, but I think it could be young men of all races and economic
Hmm.
things. They're looking into the future and they don't know what they're supposed to do next. They don't know where they're supposed to go. And to your point, um, as you have noted and you talked about, like the thing about MAGA or the extremists is like they're welcoming, right?
Yeah.
Like they will take you. They'll whoever you are, whatever it is you do, wherever you're from, if they think that you're looking for something, they'll give it to you. And I think that's a
Hmm.
very misunderstood piece of this, which is to become radicalized. The first step is you need something. The second step is like these people are willing to tell you a story that clicks with that need. And
Hmm.
they're very, very good at it. And again, that's where the rest of us have to say, like, we got to open our eyes and open our ears and open our hearts to make sure that when we see these folks, like, there is another path. Now, look, I do think, Kris, that there are more people who wake up in the morning who are good and willing to do good by a long shot. And we need to appreciate what's going on with those people too. But as you have experienced, there are a lot of people out there who, if you give them something to believe in or something to work on, as you are personal living proof of, they will far outstrip any expectation you could ever possibly have had.
Yeah. Let me tell you about something I stumbled upon last month.
Please.
I have, so one of the partner organization of Task Force Butler, like my shirt says, is Veterans Fighting Fascism.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been providing, I started using TikTok like 2 months ago, really took off, got like 100,000 followers, and I
Yeah.
started recommending books. And a bunch of my new followers started saying, like, hey, like, how about we start a book club? I created the Anti-Fascist Book Club. If people want to check it out, they can go to veteransfightingfascism.org. There'll
Sure.
be a link, right towards the top. And instead of starting this like online or digital book club, what I'm really encouraging people to do, and people have been doing, is simply like reaching out to people in their community and using this idea of a book club as some social lubricant, right?
Yep.
My old social lubricant used to be alcohol. That
Right.
is not something that's sustainable, right?
No, that burns
But
hot and fast and badly,
yeah,
as I can also personally attest. Yes.
But this book club thing, I have had like hundreds of people reaching out to me and saying like, "Hey, I just started a book club at my local library. Like we're going through these books."
Right.
So, that is something that's not for veterans exclusively. It's for everybody. It has been successful for a bunch of totally random people on the internet that I've been meeting recently,
Yeah.
and I think that it's really good, right? The books that I've recommended so far, like Ruth Ben-Ghiat's Strongmen,
Sure. Wonderful book.
uh,
Yeah.
Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny is the first
Hmm.
one everyone should start with. It's
Yep.
tiny, so you finish it real quick and you get a
Right.
nice dopamine hit. And that, if you're not a reader, you finish a book in a day and all of a sudden you're ready for another book, right? So
Right.
start with On Tyranny. That's the
Right.
best one to start with. Masha Gessen's Surviving Autocracy.
Why are
Uh,
you looking at my bookshelf? Because Kris, literally, these are all lined up in front of me.
There you go. And like these books all have purpose, right?
Right.
So Strongmen, the reason I'm recommending Strongmen is because I want for people to take a historical look at authoritarian regimes. They
Right.
don't last forever. It gives you an idea of here's what you can expect to happen over the next few years. Surviving Autocracy by Masha Gessen. I thought it was going to be like On Tyranny, which is like an instruction manual on here's what you can expect and here's how you resist 20
Right.
rules from the 20th century. That book surprised me. And it was like, you've already been surviving autocracy. You lived through the first 4 years of the Trump administration.
Right.
So you know what to expect. You've done this before. And these books are reinforcing for people. It's giving them hope for themselves. And it's building community. So, I want to encourage all of your listeners, like if they're looking for that thing, they don't want to join, I'm not joining a kickball thing. I'm not playing community softball. Like
Right.
I'm not doing anything that requires sweating or standing in the sun. Those days are over
You've
for
done
me.
that. You've done
I've
plenty of
done
that.
enough
Right.
of that. But reading books, man, has been the social lubricant for a lot of folks. So I just want to like keep preaching that
Well,
because
no,
it seems to be working.
no, and it's interesting you said that. Claire Atkin, who I had on the show just a couple of weeks ago, was talking about the book club that she had been part of for a dozen years, and my wife hosts a book club, and and she has friends, and as Claire noted, and you probably said the same thing too, is that when you sit down, right, there's 6, 8, 10, 12, whatever, you sit down, everybody hopefully has read the book, but the first 10 or 15 minutes is just catching up, and I
Mhm.
think that's really the key part is I was talking to somebody yesterday, right? If somebody goes to the book club once and meets new people or a couple of people they know, that's great. If they go a second time, even better. But the third time they meet those people, Kris, as I understand it, and there are studies that go to this, the third time they're interacting with those folks for 45 minutes, an hour, 2 hours,
Mhm.
those now become bonds that are nearly unbreakable because you've gone from somebody who you didn't know to somebody who is acquaintance to somebody who is a friend,
Yep.
right? And I just think that we can't underestimate that. And if in this time, to use a bad metaphor, Kris, that America's a Jenga game and a whole bunch of people are pulling parts out, right? The stuff we're talking about are putting the pieces back in at the
Mhm.
bottom. They're not glamorous, they're not sexy, but they're so crucial to what's going to come next because as Ruth points out in her book, and I've been trying to tell folks, there's a lot that we aren't going to be able to control over the next 4 years, right? And as you said, these movements, they tend to burn hot, tend to burn fast, and they tend to leave destruction in their wake
Mhm.
because they're by definition unstable and chaotic, and we've seen all that already, and we're going to see more of it. So the question is now, how are we rebuilding the foundation in our communities, in our cities, in our counties, in our states, and ultimately in our country, so that when this period ends, and it will end, right, that we are not left with just a gaping void, but we are left with people like you who have taken it upon themselves to take a leadership position, not for any purely crass or craven political opportunity, but because we cannot and will not move forward in this time or in the after time until and unless we have those communities where there's some level of trust, right?
Yeah.
And trust in one another leads to trust in institutions, leads to trust in bigger things, and ultimately leads to an idea that we can and should be better.
Yeah, and this idea for a book club is I see a lot of opportunities for that to be like my experience at community college.
Right.
It took a lot of personal bravery on my part because I was afraid of going to school.
Sure.
Once I got over the hardest hump of ending up in a room with people, and yeah, we all had to read books, right?
Right.
I did the hardest part, and then there I found my community, and it gave me an opportunity to be a leader again. And through that, I found purpose, right? So if this book club idea really takes off, you know, I see this as developing local leaders. Like people are sitting around waiting for better politicians. How do you develop a politician? I mean, are we going to pump them all out of the Ivy League? Like that doesn't seem to be working well
Doesn't
for
seem
us,
to be working. No.
right? The way that politicians used to be developed is at the VFW Hall or the American Legion Hall. That doesn't
Right.
exist.
Or a
Those third
PTA meeting,
spaces,
right? Or
yeah,
wherever it
those
was. Yeah.
third spaces hardly exist anymore. So these book clubs or things like the PTA, those are places where people can accidentally find out that they are leaders, right? You're
Right.
gonna have somebody who's like, well, maybe we should read 2 chapters and discuss, right? That's how it starts. It's these tiny little interactions between people that builds bonds, builds a support network, develops leaders, and that is good for our country. And it is something that we are, you know, our culture has been sorely lacking just because of technological advancements, right? It's
Right.
not because of anyone's fault. It's just because of technology and we have not adapted as well to technology and consumerism as a species as
Right.
well as, we might hope we could.
Right. Well, before I let you go, let me just say, Kris, first and foremost, thank you for joining me. There are times when, and you have been through them too, and I have been through them too, when you get up in the morning and you say, okay, I guess, I'm going to put on my Sisyphus hat and I'm going to push this rock back up the hill. It's conversations like this and the work that you're doing that, reminds me that this is not only worth doing, but also doable. But before I let you get back to the sunshine, where can everybody find you online and where can we find more information about the Task Force Butler Institute? And again, we'll put it all in the show notes as well.
Yeah, so if folks want to learn more about Task Force Butler, go to taskforcebutler.org. You can sign up on our email list. You can join our book club at veteransfightingfascism.org. And if you want to, I'm only starting to do this social media stuff for real recently,
You're very good
but I
at it.
am I thank you. And I'm committed to doing it. So my name is easy to find because it starts with a K. So Kris Goldsmith. You can find me, if you find my link tree, you've got everything, the YouTube, the Blue Sky, all the rest. So just find Kris Goldsmith, Kris Goldsmith, find my link tree, and you'll get me everywhere you need to find me.
As always, gang, you can find me on my link tree too. I used to give them all separately, Kris, but there's just too many of them now. So yeah, go to my link
Yeah,
tree. I'll also put it on the show notes. Kris, thank you so much, A, for joining me, but B, for all you're doing. And I hope that I can have you back sooner than later so we can discuss a
absolutely.
little bit about the beginning of the next Trump administration, what you've been seeing, and how I hope that even in these times, that maybe this will be the catalyst we need to bring people together again.
Yeah, I think it's going to work, man. Shared trauma, like, might not be the best way for for people to come together, but we're going to be experiencing a lot of shared trauma. So
Right.
let's build a community out of it.
Right. Everybody, again, Kris, thank you for joining me, and everybody else, we'll see you next time.